Greetings and salutations. Today's video is about the spine. This video is inspired by a conversation between me and a client. The client in question is a fellow movement professional, and she was wondering what perspective to adopt with respect to the spine. There's the more commonly thought of perspective of getting spinal extension for loading purposes. And she was wondering, well, there's that, but at the same time, when her own lower back or spine has issues, the more quote unquote flexion based PRI interventions always makes her feel better. So then, why are they different? And who's right? Who should she quote unquote believe? And things like that. So let's start by talking about the PRI inflection thing. So based on my own understanding of the principles of PRI, they aren't necessarily telling you that you should flex the spine. What they are saying is to not get your spine stuck in a certain pattern. And of course, if your spine is stuck in extension, that is still a pattern. If your spine is stuck in flexion, that is still a pattern. They don't want that. They want your brain to be able to control muscles that configure bones to whatever adaptive manner that would be most efficient to the completion of the task that you're given, that you're trying to do, be it running, walking, sprinting, hitting a ball, throwing a ball, whatever you got going on. We want the skeleton to be as adaptable as possible, and we want the brain to be as adaptable as possible, right? So then let's get into the reason why we're here. So I think, in my humble opinion, the biggest problem here is that a lot of people take the words lordosis and extension and use them interchangeably, and they do the same thing with kyphosis and flexion, right? Lordosis and kyphosis are shapes. Flexion and extension are actions, movements, activities. The two of them are not the same thing. So let's look at this guy. So that's the human spine: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, right? And let's look at the lumbar spine then. So I think most people would agree that this is a lordotic lumbar spine, as one should have. But if we look at the segmental relationship between the segments, you can see that they are neutral for the most part, right? The distance between the back of the body and the front of the bodies are not very different. They're about neutral segmentally. But this neutral segmental relationship between all these lumbar segments gives you a lordosis, right? Therefore, this is how a neutral spine should be. We can't analyze the spine as if it's actually a rope or a structure, right? The spinal column is not a structure. It is a region, and it is a series of many joints, right? Therefore, it's much more functionally useful to analyze spinal regions, or just the whole spine for that matter, segmentally, right? So for the lumbar spine, for you to extend this thing, you would put it in more lordosis. For you to flex it, you would put it in more kyphosis. But in most cases, we want them to be neither and both, depending on the task. Meaning, if you're going to load the spine in a certain way, or you're going to load the body in a certain way, you need the exact degree of lordosis or kyphosis that the task requires. Let's then go up to thoracic spine. You have a situation that is not that different, right? Segmentally, these guys are all very neutral, right? And a neutral Thoracic spine gives you a kyphosis. This is not a spine in flexion, nor, more importantly, is it a spine in extension. So let's talk about spinal loading for a little bit then. In my own opinion, extension for the sake of extension or extension for the sake of stability does not make sense, because if you were to extend beyond a neutral spine or beyond a neutral spine too much, you are then approximating your facet joints, meaning we're talking, when I say facet joints, I mean the combination of these two structures. That is a facet joint. When you put those two together, that would mean you're choosing to use them as weight-bearing structures. Well, it probably doesn't take very much to see that they aren't really made for that, and there's a lot of research backing that up. I'll cite sources in the actual post. So these are the posterior components of the vertebrae. The posterior component's not made for weight bearing. Not to say that they cannot do it. I mean, the mammalian body is infinitely adaptable, but that's not their primary function, nor are they meant to be primary weight bearing structures. That falls to the anterior component of the vertebrae, the bodies, and the intervertebral discs. I mean, look at this thing. It makes a lot more sense for these fat, big, thick things to bear your weight, or bear most of the weight that goes through them. And that the posterior components, namely the facet joints, they are made in a way that guide the motions of the intervertebral joints. Right? That makes a whole lot more sense. Right? So that's kind of why that when you start loading the skeleton, the lumbar spine goes into a little bit of flexion and start loading the bodies a little bit more. And this happens when you start going into a posterior pelvic tilt a little bit. And when you load the lower extremity, you kind of have to do that. I mean, you kind of have to do that for efficiency's sake. So if you really wanted to, you don't have to. You can start transferring your center of mass a little bit more forward, a little bit more anterior. Then you can be on your toes and get a little bit more extension in there. But that's not, anyone who's done that can tell us that that's not a very efficient way of going about doing a load-bearing activity, right? Okay, so that is the end of the talk. I hope this has been helpful. If it has not, congratulations, you just wasted some time. As always, I will see you guys next time when I have something useful. Have a nice day.